Hello, my name is Rob Eastaway, and I'm the author of the book Much Ado About Numbers, Shakespeare's Mathematical Life and Times. It was in 1597 that the first mathematics lecture was given at Gresham College, and that was 1 year after the first performance of Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet, and a year or two before the first performance of Much Ado About Nothing, which seems as good a segue as any into the subject of my lecture, which is about the connections between Shakespeare and mathematics. This lecture is going to be in two parts. The first part is about the maths and the mathematical ideas that are in Shakespeare's work, and the second part is about the mathematicians who were around in the late 16th century who seem to have influenced Shakespeare in some way, or in one case, Shakespeare might have influenced them. So one of the first interesting, more serious connections I found between maths and Shakespeare came through searching for mathematical words in his plays. So let's enter the world in which Shakespeare lived, which is the backdrop to this Gresham lecture. Here's a little quiz question. I won't ask you to offer ideas, but which of the following words does not appear in a Shakespeare play? The words are triangle, mathematics, division, and Pythagoras. Three of them do, one of them doesn't. You'll probably kind of think, well, is there a second guess this or whatever? I'll give you the answer. The correct answer is triangle. Despite the fact that many people say his plots are based around love triangles, there is no mention of the word triangle. Why not? Because he would not have studied any geometry is one reason. That is not a subject he would have encountered. There was no reason triangles had entered his life, sitting mathematically. Some of you will be looking and thinking, what was he doing working out the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle then? Actually, the reason why he mentions Pythagoras is to do with some of the strange mystical beliefs that Pythagoras had. But nonetheless, it is a maths word. But the other two are definitely mathematical references. So, Shakespeare didn't learn about triangles, but that does make us want to think, well, what did he learn about? What little we know about Shakespeare. He went to grammar school, as far as we know, in Stratford-upon-Avon from the age of 7 to 14-ish. What was grammar school like for boys? Girls did not go. Well, we can't be sure what it was like in Stratford, but in most Elizabethan schools, it looked like this. Monday to Saturday, beginning at 7 o'clock in the morning, and 7 till 11, then 1 till 5 with a 2-hour lunch break, but that's a long day. And Monday morning you are greeted with Latin text, which is what a start to the week, and an afternoon of Latin grammar. What a Monday! Well, if you don't like the look of Monday, you're not going to like the look of the rest of the week because that was all Latin as well. With a break on Thursday afternoon for going and helping on the family business, the farm or whatever. But those exams on Saturday and this was all being taught orally, it wasn't a matter of sitting down and writing, so you're repeating and learning and getting punished for not remembering things. So that's what it was. There was probably, it depended so much on the school and the teacher, there might be a visiting tutor teaching you a little bit of arithmetic. So that's what you might pick up at school. You might think, wow, that's not much maths, but think of all the subjects that aren't being touched at all. No languages, no science and so on, or nothing other than what was couched in classic literature. So what was the point? What was the point of all this Latin? It was to teach you grammar, logic, and rhetoric. How to be able to reason and think and argue and speak, and to go into professions like law and the church and so on, and playwriting, although that wasn't a career that was on anyone's list really, but wouldn't have done any harm. But if you wanted to learn mathematics, then you needed to go to university. And there, the 4 mathematical subjects, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and when we asked teenagers this, they never guessed the 4th one. I'm sure quite a few of you know that the 4th one was music, a mathematical subject. And it's interesting that when Shakespeare talks about music in a couple of cases, like in The Taming of the Shrew, it's clear that music and mathematics were sort of one and the same thing. Interestingly, there are 7 subjects in total in the liberal arts. This number 7 will come back. It's kind of a significant, mystical, symbolic number that was very important in Elizabethan times. Those first 3 subjects you learned at school were known as the trivium, from which we get the word trivial because they're just the school ones, and then the mathematics ones were the quadrivium. But all of that is kind of irrelevant to Shakespeare because he would have studied none of that university stuff. So what was Shakespeare's maths? Well, the number one thing that it was numbers. And here's one of the first really interesting things that emerged when I began to explore the history of Shakespeare and maths, which is that Shakespeare's dad, who was a glover, was pretty much the last generation in England who, when learning numbers, would only have learned Roman numerals. Indo-Arabic numerals that we know today were around. They were very popular in Europe by now, the rest of Europe by now, but in England they didn't really arrive until, well, the 1540s, a bit later than that, and so it would not have been taught in schools. Shakespeare would be pretty much the first generation to discover these numerals. And why did this matter? Well, in one particular way, it mattered an awful lot, which is if you wanted to do arithmetic with numerals. And you might be thinking, how do you add up Roman numerals? Answer is very difficult. In fact, it's very hard to find examples of addition with Roman numerals. It just didn't happen. I found this one example from a document, a manuscript from, I think, from Spain in 1530. I've now lost the source of it, but I've fortunately kept an image of it. It's a bit hard to read those numerals, so there we go. 16, 17. If you've forgotten your Roman numerals, L is 50. How do you go about adding up those Roman numerals? Well, you could start by counting the number of x's, for example. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 x's, 7 tens. Oh, except the pink one is minus 10. How confusing is that? XL is 40 and LX is 60. I mean, it's difficult. It's a mess, and it's very hard to do. What a fantastic innovation coming into England in the late 1500s, that you can add up these numbers in columns with place value and everything else to get, well, a system I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, and to answer it with 123. How did they get on in 1530? Here we go. There's the answer. CXXVII. Oh, 127. That's interesting. Had the value of numbers gone down in these 50 years? Well, no. Guy on the left, I assume it was a guy, has got it wrong, has made a mistake. Well, people have been making mistakes in arithmetic forever, including then. But the transition from Roman numerals to Indo-Arabic numerals was a slow one, and Shakespeare himself would have been sort of having to learn both, or had been exposed to both. In the neighbouring theatre to the Shakespeare Globe was the Rose Theatre, which was managed by Philip Henslow, and thankfully for the rest of us and for scholars, he kept a diary, so-called, his accounts of what was happening at the Rose Theatre. And so we can see, everyday use of numbers. And here's one page from 1596, I think that says, just saying how much money has been received for different performances on different dates. Take a look at that. There's the year, 1596, and the amount is 30 shillings, but that's Roman numerals. So he's using both. He's using Indo-Arabic numerals for the date and Roman numerals for the money, because he's kind of using both. And here's a close-up of some of his numerals. Look at the beautiful flowing way that they would write an X for 10, written with a quill, and therefore you don't want to take your quill off and put it back on again. So there we are. And but elsewhere in Henslow's diary, he does a little bit in the corner, a bit of addition of some amounts of money. That's in pounds, shillings, and pence. We'll come back to that. £211 9 and naught plus. So this is used in the new method of adding in columns like that. By the way, value of money, and then to get to what that's equivalent to now, I'd say call it multiply by 1,000. So we're talking £200,000 equivalent today. It's big bucks for something that he was doing. But notice he cannot resist on that 211 putting two little dots on top of the ones. That's the Roman numeral way of writing numbers, because he's still thinking Roman numerals as well as the new stuff. So Shakespeare might have learned some arithmetic of that sort, but certainly he would have been learning the new numerals, and he would have learnt them from a book I'll mention in a second, but he would have known the words, but it's a matter of learning how you write this new symbol for it. So there's 9 down to 1. What about the circular thing, that digit we now call 0, what was that called? Well, what it would be called officially in those days was the cipher. And an intriguing notion. The cipher, it makes us think of sort of code and mystery. And it sort of was, because here was something that represented nothing that could make numbers really big. And one of the really intriguing things is how clearly Shakespeare found this a really interesting concept. He mentions it 3 or 4 times. And my favourite example comes in the play Henry V, where at the start of the play, a character called the Chorus walks on stage and says, we're going to be talking about the Battle of Agincourt here, which is a big army, and there's only 7 of us on stage, so you're going to have to use your imagination. You're going to have to think of me as the 1, and my fellow actors as the 0s, or the ciphers, the noughts, and that way we make 1,000,000. Now, Shakespeare puts it slightly more eloquently than that. Here we go. Oh, pardon, since a crooked figure, that's the 1, come back to that in a second, attest in little place value, 1,000,000, and let us ciphers to the great account on your imaginary forces work. So there we are, there's the chorus, and there is the rest of the troupe of actors. Some of you are thinking, hang on a sec, since when was 1 crooked? It doesn't get much straighter than 1. Well, fortunately, Philip Henslowe to the rescue, because in 1599, when that play was first performed, Henslowe records things happening in 1599, and here is 1599. Let's look at that one. Numbers don't get much more crooked than that. So I have heard it debated whether the crooked figure is the 0 or the 1. I definitely fall in the camp of it's definitely the 1. It makes more sense to me. But people were tending not to do arithmetic with these new numbers. There's a lovely quote from The Winter's Tale, where the clown is like a shepherd, comes on having to do some working out of numbers to figure out how much the fleeces on his sheep are worth, what comes the wall to with all these complicated things, and he just resignedly says, I cannot do it without counters. That's the only way he could work it out. And that's how most people would be working things out. And there's a lovely print from earlier in the 16th century from what we now call Germany, which shows this transition from counters to the new form of arithmetic. On the right, we see a character looking very glum because he's using counters, and on the left, a happy person using this new innovation. So it's a good little bit of marketing for the new form of arithmetic. Now, Shakespeare knew about books of arithmetic. How do we know that? Because he quotes one in the Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio of Tybalt, described as a villain who fights by the book of arithmetic, follows the rules. Interesting how to interpret what that means, but what is this book of arithmetic? Well, the one that would have been best known in England was the first really popular English book about how to do arithmetic, a book many of you will have come across called The Ground of Arts, by Robert Record, who looks a bit scary, but apparently was a very nice guy, really tried to popularize maths and say, look, you English, we're as good as the rest of the world, so we need to learn how to do sums like they can. And one of the charming things is he introduces things like how to do your more harder times tables. Here's how to do 9 times 6. First of all, what you draw is 2 big diagonal lines. And then, to use modern terminology, you find your number bonds. 9 plus what is 10? 1. Okay, 6 plus 4 is 10. Good, that's step 2. Step 3, with your fingers, it's a bit of a cheat, work out what the right-hand column multiplies to. 1 lot of 4 is 4. And then pick a diagonal, it doesn't matter which diagonal. I'm going to choose that one, and take the number on the right from the number on the left. 6 take away 1 is 5. How cool is that? Lots of you think that's really quite cool. Yes, it does work for all numbers, but Robert Record only uses it for 6 to 9 because things like negative numbers start appearing for bigger numbers, and that was definitely not something that they really liked to think about in those days. But how beautiful this little, if a bit of a faff, why not just learn your times tables? But it does work, and some of you might like to go and prove to yourself why it works, but I'm not going to attempt to do that just now. The book by Robert Record is also full of word problems, including one that reminds me a bit of the clown in Shakespeare, because it's another one about the maths of everyday life. You know how they're always really unrealistic maths word problems? Well, they were in Shakespeare's time as well. Here we have, there are 29 men and each man hath 264 lambs. I mean, why not? But this is merely to illustrate the new method coming in of how to do long multiplication. Here's Robert Record doing that long multiplication, 264 times 29. For some reason he crosses out the 2 and the 9. 4 9's 36. I've done the little carry for you because he doesn't bother. 7, there we go, 2 3 7 6. Next line, 5 2 8, adds up to 7 6 5 6. Fantastic. Many of you looking at it saying, "But there's something really important missing," which is, where's the place holding cipher 0 that's there? I mean, you don't have to put it there. It's good practice. That's the first thing when I talk about this to school pupils. That's the first thing they notice. But of course, there's something rather more important missing, which is there's no multiplication symbol. So you've just got to know from context, this is a multiplication. Why is there no multiplication symbol? Because it hadn't been invented yet. It's not actually introduced until about 1630 by an Englishman called William Outred. And all the history I can find just says he came up with it and doesn't give any context. To me, it kind of seems obvious, and forgive me if other people have already spotted this, but this had been around since 1540. So I wonder if every time we do a multiplication, we're just reminding ourselves of that quirky little times table technique that Robert Record, I'm sure, did not invent. I'm sure he was using ones that something that was popular, say, in Italy or whatever at the time. But there we are. So Shakespeare never saw a multiplication symbol, but he did do multiplication. And lots of examples in his plays, but I'm going to show you my favourite one, which comes from Othello, where Bianca is really sad about the fact that her boyfriend has been away for a week. Her boyfriend Cassio, no relation, sadly, to the calculator that we used today. I so wish it was. So Bianca says, what? He comes back, what? A week away, keep a week away. And then she's like, I'll lay it on a bit, like 7 days, right? You get it? And she could stop there, but oh no, she decides to announce how many hours this is. Now, I don't know if you happen to know how many hours there are in a week. I would say it is not a well-known fact. If you happen to know it, fantastic. Otherwise, you're all busy working out right now that it is 168 hours. So Shakespeare's worked that out, or at least he's happy enough with it to quote it, except he doesn't say 168. That's far too clunky. How about we write this in a nice poetic way? So how would Shakespeare say 168? Well, how he says it, how Bianca says it, is 8 score 8. How beautiful is that? Nice little symmetry. 8 20s, 160 plus 8, 168. So there we are. A sign perhaps of Shakespeare, a person who loves numbers enough to play with them like that, as well as loving words, and to be creative with them as well. Can't resist showing you, by the way, it's a little secret, don't have to tell anyone else, that when I was talking to the designer of the cover of the book I was doing, I said, can you make sure that 168 appears on there? So there it is. And I'll leave numerologists to have a field day and work out the significance of the other numbers on there, which I'm not going to say anything about. But Shakespeare liked compound numbers. And here's another example from Henry V. Of fighting men, they have 60,000. 60,000. That's the French. Remember that million? It's now come down to 60,000. Shakespeare liked exaggerating numbers. The real figure was actually much lower than that, but he just conveyed the idea of the really big number, but it's 3 score, which was a popular way of saying 60 at the time, and he loved saying it that way too. He does say 60 occasionally. So Shakespeare would have learned about numbers and clearly was numerate in that way, but what about other maths? And of course, the way many of us learn maths is the numeracy side of it. So let's just have a little look at Elizabethan numeracy. And of course, a key part of numeracy in those days was the money system. And anyone here who remembers 1970, which is a few of you, but not everyone, this will be very familiar because right until 1970, the money system being used was the one that Shakespeare used. It was all based around the penny, 1d, 1 denarius, and 12 pennies in a shilling, so a 12 system, but then 20 shillings in a pound, although Shakespeare barely refers to pound because the more popular unit to discuss and to use was the crown, which was 5 shillings. So there we are. But the nice thing about having a currency that's in 12s and 20s is there's lots of different ways of carving it up. And it did make, the whole duodecimal system was very popular for centuries because of the wonderful divisibility of 12. And Shakespeare refers to all of the coins that were available. So there's the shilling, but of course half a shilling is sixpence, a tuppence or twopence, threepence, threepenny bit, and there's fractions as well, the halfpence and the quarterpence. So as an everyday thing, you are dealing with fractions and factors and so on. And there's a nice little exchange in Love's Labour's Lost, which shows a bit of banter about adding fractions. It goes like this. What's remuneration? Halfpenny farthing. Why? 3 farthing. In other words, a half plus quarter equals 3/4. How cool is that? Possibly the only time there's been a little bit of banter in a British play about fractions. Maybe there's another example. I did leave one coin out. Lovers of little facts might think, what is the gap there? Well, there's 4pence, and it's got a name. I bet you all know the name of the coin, but you may not know what it was worth. I certainly didn't, or I needed to be to look it up. It's the groat, which is 4pence. That disappeared a long time ago. But I like it for the fact that another example of Shakespeare's numeracy that I found comes in Henry IV, Part 2, where Falstaff wants to know how much money's in his purse. 30 pennies. Now, there's lots of ways Shakespeare could say 30 pennies. You could say 30 pennies, or you could say 2 and 6, 2 shillings and 6. That's a very popular way of saying that amount of money. Or half a crown, or 10 threepences. Lots of ways. But oh no, he has chosen to convey that very common amount of money by saying 7 groats and tuppence. 7 fours are 28, plus 2 is 30. I can't help thinking that's a deliberate little joke to get people to work it out and say, of all the ways of saying 30, you've said 7 groats and tuppence. There may be other reasons, but it's just such a quirky thing that it comes to such a nice number and familiar number. Is this Shakespeare just playing with numbers? And one other thing about money, if you read the sonnets, quite a few of the Shakespeare's sonnets use terms that are very much to do with accounting. Here they are. Words like profitless, usury, utmost sum, account, expense, audit, losses. They're all over the place. He uses them so often. This is surely not a coincidence. And he uses them far more often, for example, than he hardly uses any from navigation, which would be a great metaphor as well. That suggests maybe it was the accounting side was his life rather than the navigation side. It may never have left these shores. It does lend itself to the question, was Shakespeare an accountant? Which you feel like is a joke, except he was a shareholder of the Globe, and he owned property. He had to deal with his own account. To some extent, we're all accountants, but he was more so than most, which is maybe a rather different image than we normally carry for what Shakespeare was. And there he is holding a quill, a little aside, and it's sort of mathematical in to do with shape. Notice he's holding a quill, and that quill would be a goose's quill. Now, you may never have thought about this, but if you've got a goose and you pluck the quills from a goose's wings, then they curve in different directions depending on which wing you choose. So if you choose the right wing of a goose, then the quill will actually bend into your nose. It's very inconvenient. Therefore, if you're right-handed, you'd rather choose from the other wing, because then it curves away from your nose, as it does in the bust of Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is evidence that Shakespeare was genuinely a left-wing writer. Now there's a thought. Right, what else about numeracy? Well, measuring things. Julius Caesar, first scene. 2 senators spot 2 guys hanging out. What are you here for? What do you do? Why, sir, a carpenter. Where is your rule? Where is your ruler? Effectively, it means. Where are your tools of the trade? Makes me think, what did a ruler look like in Shakespeare's time? He wouldn't have used one at school, but carpenters did. And one was found on the Mary Rose, and it looks like this. How long is that ruler? 16-year-olds say it's 30 centimetres. You're absolutely right. Very close, but it's not centimetres. They've not been invented. These are, of course, this is a foot, and it's divided into inches. It's another 12 system, of course, but there are no numbers on it. Why are there no numbers on it? mainly because people probably couldn't read numbers who were using this, and you probably had a sense of half and full without needing to have the numbers laid out. And maybe too, the people making it think, should we put the Roman numerals or the Indo? Let's just not put anything on there at all. So that sort of measurement was becoming more important, but notice how imprecise it is. It's like those inches are pretty much the same, but the half inches are definitely, some are bigger than others. Partly because it was not an era of precision. For the everyday person, it was a pretty imprecise era in most things, not in everything. And another example of that is time. How did people know to turn up at 2 o'clock for the plays? And how did they know that Romeo and Juliet takes 2 hours or whatever? So here's a little thing to just let you think about. What time is it? You all know it's 3 o'clock. You heard it. Well, timekeeping was largely what you heard. When Macbeth, in Macbeth, I think it's Flaon, someone says, "The moon is down, I have not heard the clock." As opposed to seen the clock, because clocks were bells, they were things you heard, and very few people would actually have seen a clock. There would have been some sundials, hourglasses, whatever, but by and large, that's how the time was told, and it was on the hour. It's possible that Shakespeare did see an actual clock face, because the clock face at Hampton Court has been around since the 1530s or 40s, certainly pre-Shakespeare, and there it is. It's a fascinating thing. 24-hour clock, Roman numerals, of course. If you're struggling to tell the time, there's the hand. You might be thinking, where's the other hand? There is no other hand. It's just an hour hand. Minute hands were very rare because who cares about minutes? We're living in a time of, see, you're at about 3 o'clock, or in this case, about 6 o'clock. But really interesting too, what is on that hand? What is on that hand is the sun. And at the center of that clock is the earth. What's going on here? Well, at that time, the general popular view was that the earth was static and everything else moved around the earth. And that takes us to the mathematics around Shakespeare, of which he would have sort of been aware of what was going on. But the leading mathematical subject, astronomy and astrology. And we tend to think of these as two different things. Astronomy is telescopes and astrology is horoscopes. But for Shakespeare and for everyone else in those days, they were the same thing. You needed to measure the stars in order to know whether Queen Elizabeth should get crowned next Tuesday or next Wednesday. And the person at the center of this, astrology and astronomy, was John Dee, a fine mathematician with a great preface about Euclid. He had a great reputation as a mathematician, but often used that, especially later in life, to figure out much more mystical things, to discover the philosopher's stone and so on. An intriguing mix of rationality and strange mysticism. But he would have been very aware that his name comprised 4 + 3 = 7 letters, and that was significant. So 7 was a really important cultural number, as I mentioned before. And perhaps most important of all, 7 planets. The 7 planets. Everyone knew there were 7 planets, the things that wander against the star formation. And I get teenagers to sort of say, what would you think the 7 planets were? And they're very good with the first 5, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. But they're a bit surprised very often to discover that the 6th one is the moon and the 7th one is the sun. Did Shakespeare really think the sun was a planet? Well, here he is in Troilus and Cressida saying the glorious planet Sol, Latin for sun. So if he didn't believe it fully, he certainly was happy to go along with the popular view. And if you sort of think how quaint and old-fashioned for people to believe that in 7 planets and let them rule their lives, well, of course, we still let them rule our lives, absolutely, because our week of 7 days begins on Sun Day and is followed by Moon Day. You may or may not know this. If you don't know this, it's quite a surprise. Mars Day is Tuesday, Mardi, Mercury Day, Jeudi, Vendredi, and Premier League matches on Saturn Day. So there we go. But all this mysticism had intruding on it some strong mathematics, and particularly from people like Tycho Brahe, a contemporary of Shakespeare, who loved parties and astronomy. One of them killed him. It was the parties. The other thing was astronomy. He loved measuring the stars, had the world's biggest protractor, a mural quadrant in his grounds. And he and his team would measure to within 1/60th of a degree, or a tiny, maybe a fraction of a degree, what the elevation was of stars. And he'd map all of this out. It was fantastic data he was creating. But in order to do some of the calculations he was working on, he had to start working with numbers of several significant figures. So he was having to multiply things like this, but he would not have used this notation, not with a multiplication symbol and not with a decimal point, but very detailed numbers. Fortunately for him, he was able to make use of a newly invented system that allowed you to multiply very difficult numbers by turning it into addition. We are talking, of course, about not logarithms, okay? They came a bit later. Tycho Brahe actually used this wonderful thing. Prosthesis to add, aphoresis is to subtract. And a technique that lived for about 30 years called prostaphoresis. Wow. Long gone in the past, but it worked on the basis of a trigonometrical identity that cos alpha, cos beta is equal to cos alpha plus than the rest. There's a multiplication. It's easier if you turn it into an addition. So that was going on when Shakespeare was writing Romeo and Juliet. Tycho Brahe was using that. But any connection between Tycho Brahe and Shakespeare? Well, perhaps. That portrait I showed you shows all his relatives, two of whom have really interesting names, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Hamlet character's Danish, he's Danish. This portrait was known to be in London, perhaps Shakespeare saw it or friends saw it. Where did he get those names from? We don't know. There's certainly a more direct connection between Shakespeare and astronomers. In 1564, when Shakespeare was born, that's also when Galileo was born. And Galileo went on to become one of the great astronomers, of course, and he had something that Tycho Brahe did not have, which was a telescope. He could see things no one had ever seen before. And 1610, towards the very end of Shakespeare's playwriting career, he spotted the 4 moons of Jupiter. Later that year, Shakespeare writes a play called Cymbeline, and in that play, something really strange happens. A character called Posthumus, I think, is lying there asleep, and 4 ghosts walk around as if in orbit, and from the ceiling descends Jupiter. Well, I've talked to a couple of scholars who say, yep, that's definitely a nod to Galileo. This is knowledge that's spreading through, and a little reference from Shakespeare to what's going on. So that's mysteries of the heavens being unveiled, and in the daytime there was another mystery that was being examined, and it was a fascination to everyone, and that is the rainbow. Shakespeare loves rainbows, talks about them quite a lot, sometimes as Iris, the goddess of rainbows. And here's one quote, Falstaff again: "I was beaten into all the colours of the rainbow." Kind of makes you think, how many colours are there in a rainbow? What are all those colours? What would Shakespeare have said? For once, he would not have said 7, interestingly, because no one had particularly counted them. Here's a 1608 painting, so this is definitely contemporary with Shakespeare. And look at that rainbow: green, yellow, red, yellow, blue. I mean, the thing is, you couldn't take a snap or get your paints out because it had gone before you could paint it. So people kind of made it up. But in West London, during Shakespeare's peak period, there was a mathematician who was figuring this out. His name was Thomas Harriot. If you've never heard of him, one of the greatest English mathematicians, it's because he didn't publish anything. He kept it secret, perhaps because he was related. He was a bit too close to the gunpowder plotters, and he'd just keep his head down. But anyway, so he's one of the great mathematical heroes who we don't know about. And he established many of the laws of optics well before they were known to other people. He's the first European, I believe, to come up with what we now call Snell's law, but Snell gets all the credit for doing it later. So there we are. But he was also interested in atoms, the composition of matter, and the fact that he believed that things were made up of atoms, tiny particles that couldn't be broken up. He was an atomist and others were against it. And interestingly, Shakespeare mentions atoms too, a couple of times. It's as easy to count atomies, what a quaint little word, atomies he calls them, as to resolve the proposition of a lover from As You Like It. Now, here's an interesting thing. Shakespeare almost certainly never heard of Thomas Harriot because Thomas Harriot kept his head down, and why would Shakespeare have heard of him? But there is some evidence that perhaps Thomas Harriot knew of Shakespeare. Firstly, Harriot was a great friend of Walter Raleigh, who I believe we know did go to some plays at the Globe. But also, when asked in correspondence what he felt about the atom, all these arguments about atoms, he replied, "It is much ado about nothing." I wonder where he got that phrase from. It's lovely to speculate. With so many of these things with Shakespeare, you never know. But that phrase, is that perhaps because he'd not long beforehand seen that play? So, I mean, there's lots of contemporary mathematicians and the way they're sort of orbiting Shakespeare's world and maybe slight interaction there. Let's kind of go forward well post-Shakespeare, just sort of a final bit about a mathematician who was not born when Shakespeare died, but you've all heard of, Isaac Newton, who, of course, he's the guy we think of as cracking optics and coming up with our understanding of rainbows and so on today. It's Isaac Newton who established 7 colours in the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. He only actually, according to stories, saw 5, but he thought it's got to be 7 because mystical number 7, it's related to everything. And so he added in orange, which is fair enough, and indigo, which is a really weird because there is no indigo, as far as I know, in the rainbow. But he added those 2 in to make it up to 7. And his colour circle that he published in the early 1700s, I think, was not in colour because books tended not to be in colour then. There it is in black and white as he published it. How intriguing that next to each colour there is a letter starting with red, D, E, F, G. Why has he put these letters from A to G? Where else do you encounter 7 letters that go in a cycle? Music, that's where you encounter them, because Newton thought that colours were in harmony like music, and the music of the spheres. That 4th mathematical subject of music is in there, and in Shakespeare you find reference to the music of the spheres, this notion that the stars made music is just as mortals, we people can't hear them. So there we are. But to just go back to Shakespeare, and where did Newton get this idea for orange? If you like pub quiz questions, why don't any lines in Shakespeare end with the word orange? Now, you're probably thinking, okay, what would I say in this? And there's a classic thing. Everyone knows that nothing rhymes with orange. So that's it, yeah? Except most of Shakespeare doesn't rhyme anyway, so that was not a constraint on Shakespeare. So I'd say that's the least likely explanation. A better one is, as many of you will know, that the rhythm in Shakespeare's prose or verse is often in iambic pentameter. Dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. 5 dee-dums with the emphasis on the second syllable. Orange is a trochee. Do-dee, dum-dee. It's the wrong way round. So if you're going to end a line, orange isn't great if you're using iambic pentameter. I mean, Shakespeare doesn't always use iambic pentameter, but it certainly limits the chance of you using orange at the end. But I suppose the other reason is Shakespeare does use the word orange, in case you think he never used it. He does use the word orange as a colour, but hardly at all. So the probability of the 6 times he mentions the word orange of it being something that ends a line is very, very low. So that's another reason. But the significant thing is that Shakespeare did use the word orange. Because if we go back 200 years to Chaucer, in 1390 he's writing about this fox, and he wants to describe what colour it is. So he says, the fox whose colour was between yellow and red. If only there was some word I could use for this. But it wasn't. So for a long time, yellow-red was what that colour we all know now. But Shakespeare, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, twice uses orange. And my favourite example is with this blackbird, where he's describing its beak. And he says, it's orange tawny bill. Orange tawny, what does that mean? Well, tawny is the word everyone knew. Brown, Shakespeare uses it a lot, a browny sort of colour. You know what tawny port looks like. But what he's basically saying, it's brown, but it's a bit like one of those fruits you can get in the market these days. So he's sort of making a fruit reference, but it's sort of, so it's a bit like when you see a car and say it's lime green, it's green, but it's a bit like that fruit you can get in the market, it's citrus. Okay, so it's a similar sort of idea. But because of its popularity, Shakespeare is using orange, reinforcing its notion as a colour. So I would argue, people are welcome to argue, to counter-argue, perhaps Isaac Newton put orange into the rainbow because Shakespeare made it popular as a colour. Shakespeare wasn't the first, but he was certainly the most prominent person to make it a colour. So there we are. He perhaps influenced one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. Okay, so let me round up where we are at. No one ever connects math and Shakespeare, but it's possible to sort of, I've had certainly people giving me the impression they think, yeah, this is kind of fun, a whimsical diversion. It kind of doesn't really matter because you're taking one niche thing as they perceive it, Shakespeare, and another nerdy thing, math, and even more nerdy to combine the two. And I would say, actually, that's the completely wrong way to think about it. In the UK and across the world, millions of teenagers have to study Shakespeare and they have to study maths. And never is any thought, I'm sure, given in almost every case, to the fact that the two might in some way be connected. The way we educate generally is to have all of these silos of every different subject and to never make the connection between them. I think education would be so much richer for everyone and so much more real if there was an allowance of a sort of fuzziness between those borders to say, well, actually, they are connected in some ways, and language and science and so on. And my little challenge is to say, let's take any two school subjects and pair them up and see where the connections are. So, for example, the history of mathematics, which tonight this lecture is dedicated to, absolutely, it's a fascinating area of history, the history of how maths developed. Also, the mathematics of history, that's a very different thing, but how, the patterns of the way things emerged, Napoleon, the mathematics of that. So it's a whole different field. You can take every pair like this. The mathematics of Shakespeare I have been talking about, but I'll leave you with a final thought, which is, what or who is the Shakespeare of mathematics? Interesting. I hope you enjoyed the lecture and it's given you a different perspective on Shakespeare and mathematics. And if you want to hear some of the questions and answers that followed the lecture, you can find them in the description below this video. And of course, if you did enjoy the lecture, do please like it and think about subscribing to Gresham College. This was the annual lecture for the British Society for the History of Mathematics. And if you want to see some of the lectures from previous years, you can find them here.